This anesthesiologist who was influential to me when I was young said, what you have to do is internalize all of the chaos in the room and then project calm.
You're listening to a Bio Reset Medical Podcast with Dr. Cook. If you have questions or want to talk more about your symptoms and issues, you can always reach us at 650-888-7950. The following is a discussion with Andrew Skotzko from the ENLIVEN Podcast.
Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here today. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks.
One of the things that I thought would be an interesting way to start this off is a way I heard you describe a big shift in your life, which is that, as a doctor, you spent the first, significant chunk of your career, you used to knock people out, but now you wake them up. Tell me what that means to you.
My first half of my career, I am an anesthesiologist. And so what I would do is I would basically knock people out 100% by giving them general anesthesia, or else I would do nerve blocks and then give them sedation and then guide them through surgeries. And so that was basically what I did. And then now I'm using the same techniques that come from the anesthesia world to try to physiologically turn people's brains on and reset the body, which is why my company is called Bio Reset.
How did that shift happen for you? Like, was there a triggering event for you what caused you to make that shift in your own life?
I had always wanted to do integrative medicine, and yet you go to medical school, and it's a gigantic institution, and so then you sort of go on to different services, and each service has an identity and kind of a consciousness to it. Okay. And so, and it's when you go onto a service, you'll show up, and so you show up in surgery, and so they're all kind of crazy and super hardworking and wonderful, and so then you relate to them, and you're like, oh, I don't think I want to be like this because it's just, and so then you go to family medicine, you relate to them, and you go to psychiatry, so you're floating around. And when I got, and I had the wool pulled over my eyes a little bit because I went into anesthesia, mm-hmm. and they were by far the coolest people in the hospital.
And so just for context, like help me locate this in time. Like, is this when you're in med school? Is this after med school? Like, where are we?
This is when I'm in medical school. I'm in med. So this is 97.
Okay. So you're in the middle of med school.
I'm in the middle of med school, and it's the anesthesiologists are like lights out, the coolest, nicest people, and they seem totally calm.
Okay.
And so, and I was thinking, and so I'm thinking, hey, these guys are like by far what seem like super happy, wonderful people. They're my people. And so then I'm gonna evolve into being super calm like them. And what I found out is that basically it's just a total facade, because inside it's like you're dealing with this anesthesiologist who was influential to me when I was young, named Peter, said, what you have to do is internalize all of the chaos in the room and then project calm.
Okay. So
then, like, whether it's with the patient or whether it was the surgeon or the nurses, all of that is, and so we sort of orchestrated the environment. It would make everything okay. And so part of that is being a psychiatrist for them a little bit. Part of that is just guiding and being supportive and wise and thoughtful. And so next thing I know, I'm doing anesthesia, and it's like, this is super dangerous. and so I was sort of wishing that I had gone deeper into the integrated medicine. I was like, God, I made a mistake. But I was getting amazing at procedural skills and injection. So but I realized I wanted to really have that deep dive into integrated medicine. So I started like the month I got out of residency, I started studying. And so I studied acupuncture, and I studied Chinese medicine, and I studied Ayurveda, and I studied yoga and Tai Chi and all of this stuff, and ended up getting a doctorate in medical Qigong. And so I thought I was going to at some point exit anesthesia and be like kind of a integrative Andrew Weil type of character.
So wait, really quick, just for anyone who's not familiar with that term, what does integrative medicine mean? Like, what is, if I put little air quotes around that?
That's a great question, because I think it means very different things to different people. But I think it's incorporating some of the best techniques of Western medicine, and then an amalgamation of good ideas that come from many of those other places I discussed: Chinese medicine, Ayurveda. There's a lot of wisdom in naturopathy and homeopathy, and so there are integrative strategies try to put together the best of both of those, the best of East and West, I would say.
In a lot of ways, what that's saying, or what you're doing when you take that approach, is you're just being like the ultimate learner, and you're just looking at anywhere, right? You'll go to anywhere for what will work, what will help patients, and you're willing to sort of figure out how to integrate it all together to make a difference.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Yeah, that's great.
No, it's so interesting, because like one of the things that surprised me in a really pleasant way as I was getting ready for this conversation, I didn't realize that you had done so much work in the world of like pro sports. All the work you did with the Nationals, for example. Maybe you can talk about that. But the reason I thought it was especially interesting is that I would not have assumed an anesthesiologist would have spent so much time thinking about movement, for example. And I just thought it was interesting how you've gone far afield, and you've left the boundaries of your chosen domain, so to speak, in order to find these things out. And I'm curious, like, how do you approach that? How do you approach that as a learner, like going outside your discipline to find the answers in spaces where you don't know what's going on?
It's a self-funded research project that has basically been trying to solve my own problems.
Okay. Say more about that.
So then what happened is I was, and so then as my early bid, kind of 1.0 of kind of evolving away from anesthesia, because I felt immediately like, I'm just facilitating surgeries that I kind of don't always believe in.
Yeah.
And so then we were doing yoga and Tai Chi and all of these things. And once you start to do that, then we started studying kinetic chains and how force moves through the body. And then once you start to do that, then I started this deep dive into looking at musculoskeletal physiology, because we were basically trying to fix problems. And if you could fix, like, I had some back stuff and I had some knee stuff and I had shoulder stuff, neck stuff.
Sure.
So I had all of those things from playing sport.
This grab bag of pain.
A grab bag of pain. And so then you wouldn't believe how many things. So we went into, I studied Indian clubs. We were doing strength training. So we were doing all this stuff in an effort to kind of improve how force flows through the body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then once you can have it start to flow more efficiently and functionally through the body, those are the same goals that you would have whether you're a Tai Chi expert or a pro athlete or a weekend warrior. We're just trying to get force and energy to flow efficiently through the body. So then I happened to go to a meeting where people were teaching hydrodissection, which is this technique where you put fluid around nerves and do injections to fix pain. And so I showed up there, and then I called my friend Barb, and I was like, "You're not going to believe it. I found out what I'm going to do for the rest of my life," because I had been doing ultrasound guided injections all day, every day, for like 10 years.
Okay.
And so then I went to a meeting. I was like, I know more than everybody here about this. Like, this is what we're going to do. And then we're just going to wrap functional medicine around a physiological approach to the body. So then that's basically what I've done.
Is there a difference between functional medicine and integrative medicine?
There's just massive overlap. And so functional medicine is a term that is used for a thoughtful approach to talking to people, gathering kind of a real nice, robust history, and then doing a whole bunch of testing. So, for example, like what we were talking about on the phone, testing your vitamin D level, testing a whole bunch of things, and then putting all of that together and correlating it with the symptoms, and then creating treatment algorithms to support people. And many of those treatment algorithms can be integrative, but then many of those are just straight normal Western medicine approaches.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, I think the way you explained it to me, or that I've heard you explain it before, was it's kind of like being a McKinsey consultant as opposed to like just a specialist, right? You're kind of taking this systems level view and integrating across various subsystems in the body to just solve the problem, as opposed to saying, nope, I just deal with, knees.
Exactly. And that is how great organizations are doing things in the world right now. Taking a systems approach. That's the best. When medicine's at its best, it takes a systems approach.
The systems type approach to solving problems in any domain, whether that's business or medicine or just life, is very appealing, right? It's sort of intuitively appealing, but a lot of people don't know how to do it. So I'm curious if you could tell me a story, or tell me about a time when you coached, let's say you had a doctor who was coming from a more traditional approach to medicine, more of a siloed type approach. How have you coached that type of person to learn to see and think sort of systemically the way you're describing?
Oh, that's a good one. That's basically, I spent like 2 hours talking to people yesterday, trying to figure out how I could do that better. Part of that is giving people really good protocols, because everybody it's interesting. Everybody wants a protocol, which is the opposite of systems thinking.
Right. Because a protocol in this sense is like, just tell me what to do, right?
Just tell me what to do.
Just tell me what to do so I don't have to think about it.
So I don't have to think about it. And so then people really want that. Doctors want that. Patients want that. And just tell me what to do and then I'm going to do it. And yet we're trying to constantly nuance and think broader and in bigger terms. And so a lot of what I do is I just basically, I'll do it for people. People will come and I'll talk them through. We'll do cases, and then we'll go back into another room and talk about it. And I'll be like, well, what did you think about that? And it's and medicine is an art. And then if you go back to when I first did this, it's a very collaborative kind of interesting experience when you're in systems, because it'd be like we would sit down in a small group with 5 or 6 people and then work our way through this case of this 75-year-old lady that comes in with pneumonia, let's say. And that would be different today than if it was back then. And so then you're constantly evolving and sort of socializing between everybody who's working on it. And that's interestingly how medicine in the best of times happens. Because, for example, there's grand rounds or a tumor board when there's really complex patients. And so then a group of people will sit and kind of process that together. And I think when I'm at my best, I'm talking to a bunch of people with different areas of domain knowledge, and then putting that together in the most logical way and thoughtful way.
Yeah, it seems like one of your real strengths, just as I've listened to you on other interviews you've done and watched some talks you've given, it seems like you have a real strength for, I'll say synthesizing. So like synthesizing large swaths of disparate material into like distilling it down into like a cogent, coherent whole and putting handles on it so that people can actually get it, grab it, and do something with it.
Oh, thank you. That's like the only thing that I want to do in my life, actually. It's like,
well, you're doing a good job. So there you go. So, it's curious. I want to go back to a point in time. So you described just a few minutes ago, you were saying something that like right after you finish your residency, right? And you're kind of getting into the world of anesthesia and you have this like, oh shit moment where you're like, I'm in the wrong game. And I'm curious, like those moments are so scary, but they're also so transformative. And like, those are real watershed moments in our life. And I'm curious if you could just Talk to me a little bit about how you navigated that, right? We were talking right before we hit record about the idea of creating your life and the fact that it's sort of this active choice. And I'd love to hear about how you approach that, because that type of moment happens to everybody and it's scary.
Okay, so then I'll actually take you back a little bit before that.
Okay.
To the time when I was going to go into medicine. If you look at any kid right now that's a senior in college or they're pre-med, what you want is you want to make a contribution to mankind and do something great. You'd like to do some research. You want to have a clinical experience where you take care of patients, because taking care of patients is like the most gratifying part of it. And so you want to basically construct all of that together, and that is the ultimate dream of being a doctor. Oh, and then you want to teach.
Mm-hmm.
So fundamentally, and so then at academic centers, you see these guys that are like these. They teach a couple days a week. They've got a clinic 1 or 2 days a week, and then they're in a lab doing research. And so then these are the great and profound teachers that are impacting mankind. And it's like the ultimate dream of being a physician. Uh-huh. So I wanted to do that with my whole heart and soul. And so, but then I said to myself, rather than go down the academic road, I'm going to do the clinical private practice where and you make more money there. And so that was part of the appeal. And I said, then what I'll do is I'll have more flexibility to control and navigate what I do. And then I'm going to figure out how to do research and teach and then have the ultimate dream of being a doctor that does everything and then make a meaningful impact.
I love it.
Then fast forward after a couple of years, and I'm working in the surgery center. And I realized that I'm in a role and I'm trapped in the role, and it doesn't seem like there's a way to get out. And every year that you go, it seems harder and harder to get out. And then you get dependent on a lifestyle. And so then I felt like 6 or 7 years ago, the probability that I was going to make it out was like 10%. And I was like, and I remember this friend of mine whose surgery center, is this guy Sharam, who I love. I was working at a surgery center, and he said, "Here's the thing: just do this thing that you're going to do, and then keep coming and you can do my cases and do half the cases of the surgery center, and then get your new business going." And then it'll be great. And then once you get that going, I go, Sharam, I'm either going to die or I'm going to do this. And there's nothing in between. And that was great. He looked at me just like you. And then he goes, okay.
There's nothing else to say.
But I was doing the integrative medicine, and America wasn't really ready for integrative medicine at that time.
What year was this?
This is from essentially 1998 until like 6 years ago.
Okay, so it's like 2014-ish.
Yeah, and it was even like I ran into a bunch of anesthesiologists the other day at dinner that I used, but right before quarantine, and they go, "Cook, you were right." I go, "What?" They go, we mercilessly made fun of you for being gluten-free, but then it turns out everybody's like gluten. But what happened is once I figured out that, and I had always told myself the story because I heard this story about two people who were lawyers who wanted to change their career. And I heard it, I think, on Tim Ferriss. And it was interesting because I started listening to Tim Ferriss years ago. And I was like, and he gave me the hope that I was going to be able to get free. But the story was that there was this one lawyer. And so she opened up a yoga studio. And then they both hated their job. And then there's this other lawyer who became this expert in the super narrow thing of import-export legal stuff. So then what happened is he got the things that everybody wants, which is autonomy, money, and respect.
Yep.
And then basically she moved into a commoditized market where she wasn't able to get the respect she wanted because she's just like an average yoga teacher. And so the whole thing ends up not paying off. And so for me, what happened is I started doing all of these nerve treatments and fixing peripheral nerve pain and back pain and stuff like that. That was super derivative of what I'd already been doing for 15 years, but it was just like a modified approach. And so then that allowed me to sort of like be who I am within my medical practice. And it's like the greatest thing of all time. Like even now, like I said, I finally have started to make contact with anesthesiologists because they're like, I had one fly and I trained him for 2 days this week. And they're so easy for me to train because they already know like how to be sterile and how to do injections.
Yeah, they've already got all this stuff like fine.
Yeah. So then I was awesome because next thing you know, he's following me around and picking stuff up and doing things. And I was like, this is going to be so easy. And so then what happens is I'm ecstatic because I realize he's going to be free. Like I'm literally like going into the Matrix and unplugging him like Neo. and then like he's going to be free and he's going to go do whatever he's going to do. You know, so it's kind of cool.
You said something really, really powerful, but you said it so casually that I have to go back to it, which is you said something like, when you're doing this, you feel like you're finally getting to be who you are. And I'm curious, in my experience, there's always like a moment or a kind of moment that is what gives rise to people saying something like that. And I'm curious, when you think about that moment that has you like, where you just click in and you go like, yeah, this is me. This is my moment. What's that moment for you?
Okay. So my friend, Jessie told me this one, and which is interesting. And she goes, when you start she goes, in life, what you're going to do is you're going to start to attract patients. And fundamentally, the patients that you attract all have the same problems that you have. But you've either fixed your problems or you're very well on your way to fixing them. And so then you have some problem that's like 95% fixed. And so then it's like, if you had that problem and it was only 10% fixed, I would be like, oh, I've totally got you because I figured that out. And so then for me, what happened is all of a sudden I spent from the time that I was 16 until now trying to fix a bunch of stuff, like the back and the knees and the shoulder and all the stuff. And I remember like sitting with a journal and when I was 17 saying, this is going to be the year of the legs. I'm going to go do squats and I'm going to be jacked and it's going to be amazing. And then I got hurt. And so then I was like, oh God. And so then what happened is, next thing you know, we started fixing all this stuff. And so then now I walk around in clinic and it's like I see these things that's like, oh, I used to have that. And so then, it's like almost ecstatic for me because I realize, oh, I know how to fix that. And so then I just love doing it. And then maybe the most interesting thing is that I think like a huge percentage of anesthesiologists kind of are running about like 20% PTSD all the time, just because it's so unbelievably stressful. Because like you meet some 75-year-old grandmother and you're doing some surgery for her and you appropriately managed everything, got everything prepared, but then all of a sudden she starts having arrhythmia, which is like an irregular heartbeat, which those genre of things happen all the time. But if you meticulously manage it, then you can fix it right away. And so I had thousands and thousands of times where there was a problem and then I fixed it. And if I was so sort of super, super focused and which I spent every second trying to do, then you never have any problem, but you're living with the fear of that problem.
Yeah, you're always waiting for that shoe to drop.
Yeah. And so those moments of terror sort of drive you into being stuck a little bit in a fight or flight state. And so then a huge part of my early practice was then just healing all of that stuff. And it turns out everything that we do is like quite helpful for that. And when I was in medical school, I remember these guys, they were like, hey, don't go. It's kind of like walking around the VA. They're like, oh, don't go do anything in PTSD because they never get better.
Yeah.
That was this conversation that was like going on among the doctors. And so then if you're having that conversation going on, then when you start to get a little PTSD, then you're thinking, oh, but I learned in medical school that they never get better, so I'm totally screwed. So that's the existential angst then of an anesthesiologist, because you're and I ran into an anesthesiology friend of mine, and he goes, the problem is that you get re-exposed to the same potential trigger every single morning. Every morning you go back to work and you meet someone, and then you do anesthesia for them, and it's super dangerous. And yet somehow you magically get through it. But you're afraid because you remember this one time last year or 2 years ago or whenever it was when something almost happened. And so you're continually, so we do a lot in the PTSD wellness front, which is the joy of my life, because I feel like that and musculoskeletal and infectious disease, I think, are the three areas that I'm going to make a real impact, I think.
I want to actually switch gears here and start to talk about that a little bit, because I know you're kind of one of those guys out on the forefront of this type of work, right? In terms of treating, the way you described it to me was that your clinic, you basically see two kind of categories of patients. Bucket one is somebody who's very much in the like human performance and optimization camp, where, it's a total biohacker or maybe a high net worth individual or something like that, where they're really just trying to get everything possible out of what they've got to work with. But then there's this other camp of like, cases that everybody else thinks are hopeless.
Right.
And that's really kind of what you're speaking to. And you've had really amazing success there working with a variety of therapies, including ketamine. Talk to me a little bit about that. Like, in particular, the thing that you had said to me before that I'd love to hear you talk about a little more is you mentioned to me how it's there's almost like this massive societal ROI or a huge yield on like being able to reset our most vulnerable people. And that's, I think, exactly what you're speaking to right now.
Ketamine is an amazing way to help people, and you could do something profound to help the most disadvantaged people. Ketamine is an anesthesia drug that I've been using as to help because it's good for pain relief, and it's a great component of an anesthetic. So I've been using it for patients for 20 years. But it turns out it can be very helpful for people with drug-resistant depression and PTSD. And it's a mild psychedelic, but then it has this term I've been using. It's called psycholytic. And so if there's an emotional trigger and someone's on ketamine, that emotional trigger can go from like a 8 or a 10 to a 0. And because you remember everything that happens in that experience, you're able to sort of process the fact that this thing that I was like really wired up about all of a sudden turns into total calm. And so then and we do it with therapy, where we'll be talking to people and they're super frustrated about something. And then next thing you know, they're doing ketamine. And so then we say, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think? How would you? And now normally that person would be like, well, that's not true for me. Just like you can imagine a million people you've met,
just like a snap response,
including probably ourselves, right?
Oh, for sure, we all got them.
And yet, in that state, people go, oh, that's a good idea. And so now, and next thing you know, you're talking. So like my total favorite on this, and it's kind of interesting because my dad's a psychologist,
Okay.
and that's partly how I ended up in this whole thing, because I went into
that does make sense.
I went into anesthesia kind of to avoid psychiatry, because there was a joke in our family that psychiatry didn't work, and yet I see a lot of psychologists who come to see me who are in their 60s and 70s, who were somewhat overwhelmed by the stress of the experience of their career. And then what we'll do is, and I did this with my dad actually also, which was like the greatest thing of all time.
Wow.
For our relationship. And so then what happens is we process through stuff, and it's like all of a sudden you can talk about a bunch of things that before you didn't think you could talk about. And if you can just have a therapeutic conversation where you can kind of get that stuff off your chest, and then you can see that there's a trajectory for getting better. And that, I think, is the thing that happens with ketamine. And so then all of a sudden people were like, I think I'm actually going to be okay.
So it's sort of like introduces like a new, it actually, like they can see hope where there was none before.
Right. Now, the lack of hope was partly related to the fact that the emotional triggers were so profound that it didn't allow them to see anything else. But then as the triggers go away, then you're kind of just like, oh, that's an interesting idea.
So this idea of triggers is really fascinating, right? Because it's something we all have, and everyone who has even an ounce of self-awareness has experienced and noticed themselves like wildly lose their shit over something that was like, right. They've blown something way out of proportion. We've all done that. But I'm super curious, like, could you sort of in layman's terms explain a little bit about like, what is this link between our neurophysiology and our psychology? Like, what is a trigger in our brain, and like what is actually happening in the brain when you work someone through this ketamine treatment that allows what you're describing, this reframing, to actually occur?
Okay, that's a great question, and I hope that I'm going to do justice to it. We have our consciousness and our framework of how we create our identity and our structure of our preferences and who we are. Okay. Now then, that's intimately mapped into the limbic system. And so then the limbic system is emotions. And now, interestingly, in the limbic system, I've had this new way that I've been thinking about this, which is that there's emotions that are in rest and relax emotions, and then there are fight or flight emotions.
Okay.
So the fight or flight emotions are like fear and anger and worry and shame. And so then those are good emotions and super useful, because if the house was on fire, I might need to use anger to motivate somebody to do something, or I might have to. So, and we've been running through these emotions forever. Okay. Now then, the rest and relax emotions are love, acceptance, gratitude, all the touchy-feely good ones that we want to be running.
All the warm fuzzies.
The warm fuzzies.
BioReset Medical is a medical practice specializing in integrative therapies and advanced wellness protocols. At BioReset Medical, we treat some of the most challenging to diagnose and difficult to live with ailments that people suffer from today, including Lyme disease, chronic pain, PTSD, and mycotoxin illness. Our team has a wealth of experience in advanced integrative strategies to get you to optimum wellness, many of which can be conducted remotely from the comfort of your own home right now. Our team's approach is to use the most non-invasive, natural, and integrative ways possible. Find out how we can help you by reaching out to us at 650-888-7950 or at our website, www.bioresetmedical.com. It's going to be amazing.
Now, then the way that our brain works is that our prefrontal cortex and all of our senses are mapping into this part of the brain called the amygdala, which is the fight or flight control center. Mm-hmm. And if everything's cool, like right now, so I was just like, great. And so then the whole brain's on. The brain wires into the hippocampus back here, which is like the memory part of the brain. And it's contextualizing emotion, but it's contextualizing cognitively what's happening. And so we have this kind of robust, cool thing happening. But then if something comes up that insinuates that we're not safe and that we might need to change our program to fight or flight to get up and get out of here, then that can turn the fight or flight part on. And so we're constantly modulating back and forth. Like heart rate variability is kind of a measure of how quickly you can go back and forth. And so what should happen is that something crazy scary could happen. But we would realize that's gone now. And it's funny or whatever. And then we would just immediately switch back into the state.
Yeah.
And that's what happens with little kids.
It's like our default setting.
That's our default setting. Our default setting is that you think about a little kid that something crazy happens to them, and then like 10 minutes later you'd be like, hey, go take a nap, and then they'll go lie down and take a nap. But if a real stressful thing happened to you, you're not going to be able to go take a nap 10 minutes later.
Yeah.
Now, what happens is there are topics that are related to our consciousness and our construct, our identity of who we are. And if that gets triggered, then what it does is it triggers a fight or flight response. And then that turns on the fight or flight emotions, which is like this anger, fear, shame. And so then all of a sudden that can totally derail you, because then all of a sudden those emotions take over and become overwhelming. And they start to take over the consciousness, because what they're doing is they're taking they're this incredible, powerful flavoring to an idea. And so there's an idea that might be a good idea, but then if there's a whole bunch of shame and worry and anger around that, it just like seems out of control. Mm-hmm. But then if the warm and fuzzy emotions are running around that idea, it might be like the greatest idea of all time. Now, part of our construct of our ego and stuff is what you hear this term called the default mode network. What happens is learning to rewire the brain so that you're practicing being more in control. And so those triggers are often, if that's true, then that says something about me that I don't like. Mm-hmm. And that is worrisome, because if that's true, that means I'm not safe.
Yep.
And what happens is that happens so quickly that it leads to like a little bit of a rage response of like, because you don't want that to be true. And so then you'll almost fight, which paradoxically makes it true. And so then what you have to do is sort of, as you start to defrag these, and then you start to realize that there's like an entire universe inside here. And so then all of a sudden, then it's like I say, oh, okay, guess what? My identity I'm kind of interested in my identity, but it's like evolving so quickly that like my identity at the end of this COVID thing is going to be different than it was now. And so therefore, if you said something that was like triggering, that might be triggering to my identity now, but it may not be triggering to my future identity. Mm-hmm. Then this becomes this sort of logic game. And so then I go, oh, okay, well, so that's triggering to me now, but it's not triggering to the me in the future.
Okay.
And so then if I'm able to work my way through a timeline and I realize, oh, so then I don't need to be triggered by it now.
Okay. Yeah.
because I'm not super wired into like whatever my identity is. Like, let's say you said, and so then what that allows you to do is to navigate through things and not be too triggered if people disagree, because you're not threatened by the fact that you're not going to feel safe. That's the fundamental thing.
Yeah. So let me just pause you for a second, make sure I'm with you. I'm going to try and recap that in
Okay.
layman's terms. So what I think you're saying, and please correct me where I'm getting this wrong, is there's like kind of a multi-part system going on here, right? So there's like the mental, I think you called it like an idea or a mental formation, right? There's a concept in your mind, and then that concept is sort of like has wired in associations that trigger emotions to go along with it, right? So they can be the idea of shame, or an event that there's an event, and then that's wired to the emotions of shame, for example, and that is sort of like kicking in. So event happens, that's the trigger. It kicks off this entire cascading effect of emotions that takes over the nervous system. Off you go into fight or flight, and next thing you know, you don't even know what's going on. And so it seems like what's happening under the treatments that you all are creating is that you're using assistive interventions like ketamine, for example, which has a psychological and physiological effect of kind of like making you feel, first of all, really safe. And so you feel safe. And then I think you also, I think in the research, I found that you're also doing things like stellate ganglion blocks to like turn off the fight or flight nervous system.
Right.
And so it seems like you're almost like using this intervention to go and like snip the wire that's linking this mental formation to an automatic response. So you can then kind of talk through and introduce a new linkage. Is that what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah, that is exactly what's going on. But then my attitude is, once you figure out how to do this, then you don't need to do any of those other things. And so then like the people that are like most influential to me are like artists and comedians and stuff like that. And so then like what would happen is, if Dave Chappelle or Jerry Seinfeld, like I've been watching a lot of them lately, if they saw something, they would just call that out. They'd be like, well, that's crazy. And in a funny way, call out the behavior rather than getting triggered by it. Because as soon as you comment on it, that takes all of the power away from it.
Because you externalized it, you've given language to it. It's not you anymore.
Yeah. And so then this is like a practice, and ketamine is just like some training wheels to kind of get somebody going, or a stellate ganglion block is like a hard reboot of like the central nervous system. But then once you kind of get going, then the issue is that there's going to be a bunch of conversations like this that are like non-triggering, or it's like totally non-triggering for me anyways. And so then but then there's a bunch of other conversations that are slightly harder, and then some that are very difficult in life. And so then what happens is learning to navigate the difficult ones, where you can call out like a comedian does. That is starting to make me feel this way. And then if you can diagnose that happening real time, and then you can almost like see yourself going into fight or flight. This is what I just started being able to do only like in the last 6 months, and then go, oh, okay, that I was triggered by that, but there's like totally no reason for me to be triggered by that. Like I'll generally almost always realize, and that trigger is generally based on an idea that I picked up hook, line, and sinker from 10 years ago. Or it was an idea that my parents had, and so I just bought that hook, line, and sinker.
Yep, been carrying this thing around my whole life and didn't even realize it.
And then that's why I go to this timeline, because then I go, oh, okay, I'm triggered by this now, but that's probably not even me. That's just something that I picked up. And so I'm probably going to let that go, which means like almost anything that I'm triggered by now, I'm guessing that I'm not going to be triggered by it in 5 years.
Yeah.
Now I'll be triggered by other things, right? But then what happens is that it leads to this evolution of consciousness, where next thing you know, you're navigating like what I can tell you is I've been super enjoying my life like 100 times more than I've ever enjoyed it before, kind of doing this principle.
Now, this is so fascinating to me, because like it's like a shift in a mental formation under the right conditions can create these like radically cascading effects neurologically, physiologically, and psychologically. That's just incredible. Like that's like all bets are off kind of territory.
This is great. This is so great. So there's a percentage of people who will show up and they'll be like, you know what? I listened to everything and I know it to be true, but it's just not true yet. But I know that I'm going to do everything and then I'm going to be okay. And then sure enough, they will be.
Yeah.
And then there's another group of people that are even in the end stage chronic pain, and then I'll start to see them. And then they will also follow kind of the similar trajectory because it's getting your head wrapped around the idea that it's like, there's a way to live that's basically super easy and pleasant and wonderful. And we were designed to be able to have the sirens start to go off if the house is on fire. But then we should be just basically having a great time the rest of the time, telling stories and
kicking it and enjoying ourselves. Yeah.
Enjoying ourselves. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. So one thing I'm curious about is like, because what you were just describing there, in a lot of ways, you could kind of, in the world of psychedelics, that's often referred to as like set and setting, right? Like an intention, right? The way people approach something and their mental sort of where they're at mentally, their intentions for doing it, and then literally like where they do it and does that make them feel safe and all that. It seems to have this huge effect, right? Like you were just describing, someone comes to you and they're already like bought in. It's going to go better than someone who's like, I guess we'll try it. But is there a sense you've picked up like why that actually makes such a difference? Like what is going on that concept, the presence of that concept makes such a difference?
Okay. So we're hanging out right now. Everything's mapping in. And so if the setting is amazing, you're turning the volume way up on warm and fuzzies.
Okay.
Now then the concept of, and then I could go into any substance you want. I could talk you through the physiology of it, but in broad terms, if you turn up the volume on warm and fuzzies, then the consciousness sort of sits on top of that. And so then what's going on in the limbic system then starts to massively influence consciousness. Because if you're feeling warm and fuzzies, then you're going to be having intellectual thoughts that have a warm and fuzzy vibe to them. In parallel to that, the opposite is that if you're set in settings chaos, then that's driving the opposite consciousness.
Right. Like the idea that the emotions drive the thoughts just as much as the thoughts drive the emotions.
Yes. Yeah. And so now then the name of the game is then trying to figure out how to hack warm and fuzzies and then connecting that to an idea of consciousness and an identity. And so for example, like some of the psychedelics will sort of defrag the default mode network a little bit. And so it'll soften our view of identity of ourselves and then make us way more open to connection to other people.
So really quick, I just wanted to clarify two things. So default mode network, for people who aren't familiar, and please correct me where I get this wrong, is kind of like when you're doing nothing, that's what's active in your brain, right? When you're just like taking a walk, doing whatever, that's the part of the brain that is sort of generally on and dominant. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's okay. And it's also, and it really relates to ego and our sense of identity to some extent.
So sort of self-referential. It's like the seat of the identity in the ego.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about defragging it, what does defragging kind of mean in this context? So then like there's this question like, who are you? Right. And so then that's like this something that you can begin to explore. And so then as you start to explore and contextualize who you are, then all of a sudden you realize, oh, okay, maybe that's who I was, but now that it becomes this evolving thing. And and so I think
meditation, mindfulness, yoga, breathing, functional medicine, integrative medicine, regenerative medicine, every technique that we have allows you to start to journey into continually recreating who you are, and then how that relates to the entire nervous system, and then putting that together and then just being who you are. And most people I think are somewhat trapped in an identity that was created in the past, but they're living it out. So like that was why I think I was trapped by a decision that I made to go into anesthesia. And so then I was just like my entire identity was doing something. It's interesting. Like what happened is I was like triggered by things about like insurance and stuff like that. And so I remember, but then what happened is then I left that behind. I don't even like, I'm completely not triggered by it, but it's like, because it's not even on my radar screen of something that's relatable to me. And so then that's an example of, as soon as you start to evolve into the idea that you're evolving, then that's amazing, because then now you can just take yourself wherever you want to go.
That's so fascinating, because it's like, so I'm very interested in meditation and mindfulness, and I started practicing like 13 years ago or something like that. And it's been an incredibly fascinating journey for me. And just listening to you now, I'm starting to understand why it works. Even the idea you just described is the idea that the idea of the self is just that. It's an idea, right? And so it's shiftable in the same way any other idea is shiftable, which is just, I mean, like that's so simple. It's profound. I think it's amazing. Like, in your story, I hear you as someone who you were trapped in the concept of I'm an anesthesiologist, which is very different than I'm someone who does anesthesiology.
Right.
Like your identity was anesthesiologist as opposed to, how do you conceive of that now, by the way? I'm curious. Like, what do you conceive of yourself as now, identity wise, since you shifted from being boxed in by the label anesthesiologist?
I'll tell people like I'm an anesthesiologist. Like I'll say that. Like what kind of doctor are you? I'll say I'm an anesthesiologist. And yet, like I think of myself as a physician, and I'm thinking of myself as just trying to understand the human body, basically, and soul. And so then just like, and so you're trying to understand the human body, you're trying to understand consciousness. So that's like this goal. And then and you hear about it, what do you call that? The practice of medicine. So it's just a practice, because like whatever I did, as great as it was, is, let's just say, probably not going to work for you, because you're special and unique, and I've got to figure it out all over again, because it's the practice of medicine, because I'm just going to relate to you and we're going to figure it out, and then that's going to be magical. And so it's the practice. Now, the practice of mindfulness and meditation is also kind of amazing, because what that does is that pulls you a little bit out of the ego construct and kind of gets you calmer. And so then living your life is almost like a practice. Like part of what I'm trying to do is just kind of get people to understand the reality that they're going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay. And then they can start to do this. And I always say, if I was good enough at what I'm trying to do, then I wouldn't need to do ketamine or stellate ganglion blocks or anything like that. And I'm pretty sure that what's going to happen is there's going to be like 10 people who listen to this podcast who kind of get it. And then they start to basically rewire the architecture of their central nervous system. And then next thing you know, once you start to just run this program, it's just like an amazing program, and you're going to be fine.
It would be awesome if everybody had access to you or someone like you. Unfortunately, not everyone does right now. And we'll come back to the sort of societal ROI bit here in a second. But for someone who doesn't, what could they do starting today to run this program?
I think what I think the thing is you've got to be easy on yourself, because you've been whatever story that you bought or picked up is a story that was like from you picked up when you're 5 from your parents said something, you bought it hook, line, and sinker. And so then you just got to be easy on yourself. So if you get super triggered today, then just give yourself a mulligan and realize it's going to be okay, because I'm going to get over it. And then as you start to get triggered, what I try to do is I try to be Jerry Seinfeld all the time in my mind. So I'm trying, if I can call out the absurdity or the insanity of something, then I'm definitely not going to be triggered, and everyone else is going to laugh. So comedy, I think, is like one of the most effective strategies. And then suspending disbelief. What I've noticed, something triggering is said, and then all of a sudden the alarm bells start going off. Now, if this was a practice, then the idea is that when you start to see that coming towards you in slow motion, you're like, oh, okay, so this is happening, and then I'm having these feelings. So then I'm just going to kind of breathe with that a little bit, and I'm going to suspend disbelief. I'm not going to like go into that and I'm just going to like, okay, I've got to wait. And so then a lot of times I'll just like sit for like even a minute. I'll just be like, okay. And then what will happen is often just that amount of time is enough for you to realize, oh, that was stupid that I was reacting that way. It's almost always like, it's not, even with me, I would say if I went back and looked at the game tape of every 10 times that I was triggered, I would kind of blame myself like 90% of the time. And then as a result, then you feel bad about yourself. And so it's like this thing, but then loop. So then you're basically just defragging those loops.
It reminds me of a way I explained the benefit of meditation to a friend who was like curious, but he's like, yeah, it sounds cool, but like I don't get practically like why to do it, right? Because it takes time and consistency and blah blah blah. And the only way that I was able to land it for him was I was like, imagine you're standing on a platform at a train station, and you're there. And all of a sudden, you feel that like rush of wind that's kind of like shaking your, blowing through your hair and like hitting your face. And you look over and you like can see this train coming, right? You're standing on the platform. You just see the train pulling in. You see it coming. And like you have some sense of where that train is going to go, right? Because you know what platform you're on and it's going to this city and whatever. And I was like, it's kind of like that, but in your normal life. Like you see this thought coming down the tracks, and you kind of have that moment of choice, because now that you're aware of it, you have a choice about like, do I get on the train or do I not?
Oh, good.
And you can stand there and let the train, like you can stand there, watch the doors open on the train, like you're in the subway, and then let them close and watch the train pull out. And you just didn't get on board. And you still felt all of the rush of the train coming in, and you feel the rush of the train coming out, but you didn't get on board.
Oh my God, that is so good. Yeah. Yeah.
That's like the only, and like speaking for myself, that has saved, like that alone has saved me so many times. Like even last night, there was a moment where I got really triggered.
Oh, really?
And I was like, oh shit. Yeah, I got super triggered about some dumb shit. And I was like, I could see it happening. And I was like, okay. All right. And I like excused myself for a minute, just went to the bathroom, and I just like sat there and breathed for a minute it was one of those things where you're like, oh yeah, there's that train. That's that thing happening again. Right. But as you said, like if you wait, if you just keep breathing and wait, it like the train will leave, and thank God you're not on board, because I would have ruined the dinner.
That would have ruined the dinner. Right. Isn't that amazing? And so what was it? Your limbic system, you could feel that you were willing to kind of let it go. What was going on in your mind as you were letting that train come in and go out of the station? What were you telling yourself?
Well, the first thing was, I think because I've made the mistake of getting on that train before. And so I now know that train, and I know where that train goes.
Yeah.
And so I think maybe we have to screw it up first, at least once, to know where that train goes. And then now I recognize that train coming in, and it has a certain sort of like tone to it. It has like a feeling tone. And I'm like, there's that thing. And I feel the pull of it emotionally. I feel it pulling me almost like a gravity well.
Right.
And I know I have an association now where like, I know that feeling where it goes. And so, that's what it's like, is I can feel it. And then it's literally just that choice of like, I'm like, okay, you know what's happening.
Okay, so then we'll go into this then. What can you want to say, what category of trigger was this? Was it about who you are, or is it about what genre of trigger?
Personal worth and value. So it was around like shame.
Oh, oldest one in the book. That's the oldest one. I had so much, like, it's interesting. I had a lot of shame. And I don't know why. I don't know. It was like almost cultural or something like that. And we have this joke that like whenever, if that topic comes up, I'll be like, hey, we have a special like in the clinic today. And I actually have been collecting a bunch of shame, and we put it in garbage bags in the back, and we're giving it away for $10. So if you want, like, and joking about it, so it's because that. So then this is, I haven't really talked about this, but this is what I think is going on, is that shame part of the limbic system is hardwired into the fight or flight part of the nervous system, because it's one of the fight or flight emotions. And so then what it can do is it can take you in the middle of a wonderful dinner party into a moment that is crazy, right? Like you can't imagine you can't imagine a scenario where blowing the dinner party up is a good idea, right? And yet you could totally do it. That's why this is a practice, just like the practice of meditation. And interestingly, apparently, I don't personally know Jerry Seinfeld, but apparently, like, he's real big on meditation. And like, as you start to, and what I think my biggest influence of my life now is like seeing the wise people who come to see me. I learn more from them than they learn from me. And so they'll tell me stuff. And this guy Dave from Hawaii, just so he knows who I'm talking about, he goes, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing again and again, thinking there's going to be a different outcome. And that's kind of like that train's coming in, right? The train's coming into the station, and you're thinking, if I blow this up, it's going to be different from the last 10 times, right? But then he goes, the definition of wisdom is, and I loved this, I just totally love this. He goes, is if there is a new data point that you find is true, and then that means other things that are in your ecosystem are therefore false, you may have to let go of those belief systems. Now then, that as a sort of a mental or a psychological construct is amazing, because then next thing you know, you can very quickly start to defrag and let go of belief systems that you used to have, that you held totally firmly. Like, I had all of these belief systems when I was working in ICUs in the hospitals, that I have totally different belief systems now. But it took me 10,000 times of watching that train come into the station and go, okay, that belief system is not working. So then where is my new belief system? What is truth? And then basically trying to constantly update that in search of the next direction.
I love that. So I actually want to come back now. So we've covered so much interesting ground here around the mind and what's happening in these types of interventions, whether that's meditation or ketamine or anything like this. I'd love to I want to circle back to something we touched on earlier. We talked about there's this ROI to like helping the people who are most vulnerable, right? And I know it's certainly it's something you've been doing lately with your staff, right? I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how you're using the knowledge and the practices that you've developed to actually make the people, support the people in your organization and in turn your patients. And that sort of seems like an example of the ROI you were talking about on a larger scale.
Oh yeah, so it's interesting. So you're so interesting with what's going on with the whole COVID thing, because everybody, and so to go back to what we're talking about, fight or flight and fear and all of that stuff, all of those emotions, all of that stuff is like the volume's turned up to 10. So it's almost like it's so interesting. And so then what I decided to do is we've been doing IVs on anybody in the staff that wants them pretty much every day. So we've been doing IVs, and we've been doing, and then we've been doing some of the PTSD work that we do. And the feedback that I got, and I wasn't really looking for, I was just kind of like, well, what happened? And the feedback that I got, it was always in the genre of, oh, we're going to be okay. It's like, we're going to be okay as an organization. We are going to be okay as we go back and start treating patients and helping them. And so I did it as a test, and it was amazing to see it, because as soon as they realize they're going to be okay, when a patient comes in, the patient's going to realize they're going to be okay because the staff's okay. And it's interesting because I'm trying to get some people to try to help. We're writing a clinical trial. We've written a couple, and I'd like to go to a real underserved area and start to treat people and do it as a scientific approach and help the most disenfranchised, because this moment is so overwhelming from a PTSD front, from a medical front, from an economic front. And I feel like it would make as much sense in Compton if I could figure out how to reach it there as where I am. And it's just going to have to be different price points. But what I'm hoping to do is that as we begin to realize that there's more hope, as we begin to realize that like there's a chance that we're going to be okay, I want everybody in society to realize that. And it doesn't. And once and it's interesting, like the 100 monkeys kind of idea.
What's that? I don't know that idea.
Oh, so their idea is this, like if it takes like 10 hours to teach a monkey how to do something.
Okay.
So then you bring another monkey in, and they're living together, and it takes 10 hours to teach them something. And so then eventually there's like 99 monkeys. By the time you get the 99th monkey or the 100th monkey there, he walks in, looks around, sees all the other monkeys doing stuff, and he learns it in 1 minute.
Ah, okay. He just does what they're all doing.
He just does what they're doing. He picks it up, and then he's fine. And so then what my idea is that we're monkey like 5 and 6. But then once people begin to realize kind of like a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, then all of a sudden, because of the existential angst and the idea, they thought that they weren't going to be okay, they weren't going to make it, was so overwhelming, they kind of gave up. But when they look around and they realize, oh, there's like a relatively simple construct that you can just start to apply, what I think is going to happen is then maybe 70% of people could do it and be totally fine, and they wouldn't need any of these other things, because they would just realize that there's a way to kind of manage the mental, emotional, physical, spiritual state in just kind of a functional, healthy way, and then reset everything.
No, I love this, because it's sort of, I think the way you described it to me once before was, there's like this idea, I think you called it like the existential pain that we all carry, right? There's this fear that we all have that, there's this hunch that it's all going to fall apart, right? There's this sort of latent, low grade, persistent anxiety of the next shoe's about to drop. Yes. And at some point, if we're able to realize like, oh, and even if that's true, I'm okay, it's all going to be okay, that suddenly there's this like, there's like this release. And the idea that you can create that for some of the most vulnerable people in any system, whether that's a company, a society, whatever, it really just adds, I think the word I heard you use before that I really liked was like coherence, right? It increases the overall coherence for the entirety of that system when you can level up the experience of the most disenfranchised, the most at risk.
Yeah. It was amazing to see how helpful it was to start to do IVs and stuff like that and help people within our practice, which is super small. Like 20 people. But it's tricky because there's a very interesting conversation now about what's evidence-based and what's not evidence-based in medicine. And so people are listening and kind of going after people who appear to be trying to profit or trying to sell something that is not doesn't have evidence. And yet most of the approaches that I'm talking about are not FDA approved and they're early. And so
Sure.
And so it's very interesting kind of, and the volume on that controversy got turned up to 10 with COVID, so, which is why I'm, anything that I do in that space is going to be part of a IRB approved. It stands for Institutional Review Board, where people given a consent form that has been approved by like an ethics committee and stuff like that. But it's going to be an interesting, because for example, Google and the search engine algorithms are not allowing people to market experimental procedures. So there's going to be a very interesting sort of evolution of voices in medicine, and so then, like I said, I came from the heart of the medical industrial complex. So I came from a world that was very, I would say, a similar mindset to somebody like Fauci. You know what I mean? And so then having kind of conversations and then tracking that through this moment in time, and then through like new iterations of like who we are, I super look forward to, because it's just that same conversation that we were talking about is like kind of furthering, gathering more data and getting better, and then continually re-asking yourself the same questions.
Yeah, for sure. It's so interesting, like your work, with, you do a lot of clinical work with individuals, right? Dealing with, sometimes it's the optimization side of things, but other times, as we've talked about, it's dealing with debilitating levels of anxiety or PTSD, and using this whole suite of tools that you've already got and that you're continuing to discover to reset these systems and sort of restore people to their natural wellness is amazing. And I'm really curious, as someone, I think a lot about and talk a lot about on this show about, what is the future of business? How do we use products and services to not only enliven people, but also to enliven organizations in the spaces that we all inhabit together? And I'm curious if you're seeing anything like this make its way into the organizational level, like almost biohacking or neurohacking at the organizational level with some of these cutting edge groups. Is there something like that going on, or what are you seeing there?
That's amazing. First of all, if there's an organization that wants to do that, I would love to do that for your organization. And so then what you have to do is you have to do a real good job of having some things that are protocol oriented, kind of like what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And then also creating the space for systems thinking and collaboration. And so then this is interesting. I have been super interested in like wellness, like workplace wellness.
Yeah.
And yet I've always thought of it as kind of a con. Because it was mainly like in medicine, if you had to go see the wellness committee, there was a problem. and it was just like an excuse to get rid of people, you know what I mean? And so finding a constructive way to support people is going to be crucial. And I think that there are a bunch of elements of what I'm talking about that could be wrapped into like a corporate kind of identity that would help people be more functional and less in fear and less in kind of fight or flight. Because the less than I'm in fight or flight I am, the way more effective I'm going to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're more creative. You're going to be more connected. You're going to communicate better.
And yet there's a little bit of a fear of if I spend a whole bunch of time doing that, I'm not going to be efficient at getting work done. And so then like that, it's like a double-edged sword. But what I think is going to happen is there are going to be organizations and groups that are going to start to deploy these. And then what's going to happen is, and I'm convinced about this. So my hypothesis is that over time, I'm going to be cheaper and I will compete against insurance companies at like anything. I'm just going to start with like easy things. So like, for example, the one that I would, the first one I would do would be like, okay, I'll compete against insurance companies for total knee replacement. Because I think what I would do would be cheaper than total knee replacement. And so then you just start to do some data and analyze that. And so then what will happen is as organizations begin to deploy this genre of technology, they will quickly find out what the ROI is on each of 60 different categories. And so then all of a sudden you may see big organizations find out, oh, okay, well, this actually is totally going to pay off because each, that's like 200, there's a whole bunch of data points that each person could have. And so it's going to take time to deploy different technology to improve whatever the problems are, and then to track those outcomes and see what happens with efficiency. But to some extent, anytime an organization seems to care, it's like, remember Google, like in the early days, it was like, don't be evil. If you have a feeling that your organization super cares about you, then you're probably going to do an amazing job of working.
Yeah, you're going to work that much harder. It's interesting. Like I wonder, part of my brain goes like, I can imagine a future like where this stuff is available within the sort of the spectrum of corporate wellness in the same way that like mindfulness has moved into almost mainstream corporate wellness, right? That I think I could totally see this sort of biohacking stuff getting towards that same level where you can imagine, the Googles of the world, the Apples of the world, having these things available for people, because they, I think over time we'll see. I mean, we don't know. We don't have the full on studies yet, which is why hopefully we get some, and we can create some studies. But I think we'll see the data. I basically share your hypothesis that the data will prove out that like this is so worth it. Right.
And so then we just have to find the right package of things that are relatively inexpensive, that are relatively high reward, and then deploying those in an organization, and then when people start to get better, that up levels the whole organization, and the consciousness of everybody is like, oh, we're like, it's almost the same thing I was talking about for an individual, but everybody in the organization starts to realize, oh, we're going to be okay. And so then we just have to figure out what the protocols are and what the price points are to begin to deploy that for large groups of people. And then you begin to say, oh, okay, well, we could deploy, as soon as you can have that genre of thinking, then we could do that at Apple, but we could also do that in the inner city.
Yeah, I love that. As we move forward into this future, there's going to be so many of these new treatments available, right? And there's going to be new studies coming out, and this is a little bit of the Wild West for people, which is exciting on the one hand. It can also be overwhelming for people. It can be confusing, scary, all of these things. And whether we're talking about some of the treatments that we're talking about in this conversation, like the ketamine stuff, or anything else that's going to come out, like all the COVID treatments that are under development, et cetera, et cetera. So how should listeners actually evaluate studies or medical claims that they come across, because most people are not trained scientists and we're kind of out in the Wild West here. So how would you recommend that a listener evaluate a medical claim that they see in terms of like thinking about the quality of the studies, or otherwise basically trying to like figure out what's the good stuff and what's quackery?
Right. So that's a phenomenally good question. I think it's experiences like this, people can kind of hear at least where I'm coming from, the genre of where I'm coming from. And I didn't dig too deep scientifically into much today, but then so you're going to be able to take that. Normally, there's this long peer review process for trials. And what's happening is people are publishing work, and then we're going back and looking at it and going, hey, that wasn't as good as we thought it was. So for example, like with COVID, there was a drug that came out, a drug combination of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, which are two drugs. And the concept was, if you looked at the early papers, it seems like this drug's a home run and is going to solve everything. And it wasn't that by any stretch of the imagination, I think. And so there was problems with that study. And so then on my podcast, I started to interview people who started to criticize that research a little bit, and then start to have a conversation around it. I had another one recently where we talked about the testing that's happening, because there's a whole bunch of problems with that. And there's not an easy way for a layperson to do it, but I think there's a lot of great voices in the integrative space, and I think they're starting to, like Mark Hyman, I think is a great voice, and he's someone you can listen to. I think a lot of the influencers are great because they're finding people out there that are doing things and then shining a light on them. And it's a social, and it's a medical, and it's a scientific, and it's a collaborative kind of process where the whole world's kind of doing this together right now. And we're literally making it happen, and science is being shared, and people that were in silos are all of a sudden, those are all coming down. And what I think is going to happen is that there's a friend of mine's developing a platform that's going to try to answer this question. And so what's going to happen is there's going to be evolving technology, evolving experiences that we have that begin to bring data in. I'm in Silicon Valley, so they always say he who has the most data wins. And so then, it's going to be an evolving and kind of nuanced thing. I wish I had a better answer than that.
Two resources that listeners might find useful on the sort of question about evaluating medical claims. That these are ones I just recently came across that I can't fully endorse them yet, but they come from sources that I trust. So I think they're probably really good, but I can't fully sign off on them yet, but worth checking out. One is a book called Bad Science by a guy named, I think it's Ben Goldacre. And then the other one, there's another doctor who's has a great podcast that I really like. In addition to Matt's, his name is Peter Attia, and he has a series on studying studies, and it's basically thinking about how to evaluate medical studies and scientific studies that you come across, so that when you see some medical claim, you can, kind of think for yourself about how legit is it, basically. So we'll link to all that in the show notes, but those are two that I have that came up in my research for this conversation that I wanted to at least mention. Yeah,
he's really good. Peter is really good.
Yeah, I really like his stuff. He's got some great stuff, great podcast as well.
Yeah.
So a couple of rapid fire questions for you. The first one is, you talked earlier in our conversation about wanting to make a certain meaningful impact, and how you feel like you're starting to, and you can start to see that arc in your work. What is that impact you want to have?
I want to make a really big impact in the space of depression, anxiety, PTSD. And I want to make people aware that they have way more control over those things than they thought they did. And then I want to basically introduce the concept of some genre of a practice that they can deploy to make that dream a reality.
I love it. I love it. And then in recent memory, and that could be a week, it can be a year, whatever. What is a small change that you've made that's had an outsized impact on you or your life or how you show up?
It's interesting. I do like 2 or 3 small changes like every single day. It's like
Constantly experimenting. I love it.
And I think that maybe that is it's that. And you know, I was thinking of this story. There was the you know how people can get an ulcer in their stomach.
I think, yeah, it's like bacterial, right?
Well, so that's great. It's perfect. So what happened is the idea was that it was from too much acid and stuff like that. But the idea was definitely not that it's bacterial. And in fact,
yeah, it was like everybody thought it was like stress and things like that.
Yeah, and so this guy had this idea that was a very alternate idea, which is that it could be bacteria. And so it was, and so then he had a patient who had that bacteria, and then he inoculated himself with it, and he got an ulcer. Now, what happens is that was such an out of the box idea that they tried to kick him out of like the Society of Gastroenterologists that he was in, and because it was just an anathema to them. And but he ends up obviously winning a Nobel Prize because he totally changes our way that we think about gastroenterology from then on. And so then my little thing that I'm trying to do is to basically keep my ears and eyes open for noticing truth, and then doggedly following that. So that because I'm hopeful that I will continue to do that, and then in doing so, there's a whole bunch of things that are currently dogma that will not be dogma in the future. And so then finding that out, because as soon as you find that out and then change your consciousness around that, then that leads to superhuman growth. Because when we're trapped in dogmas, we're super dysfunctional. And now it's hard to do that because you're contextualizing this problem that we're talking about, which is that the data. And then what happens when you're starting to look at the science is that there's an enormous amount of bias. So when you say what is quackery, there are certain people that have a bias that anything that's not what they believe is quackery. And so then it's a nuance. And now that's the reason that the practice of medicine is so awesome, because then it's just like what my approach is going to be new with each new person that comes in, because you're kind of figuring that out. But as you do clinically, you start to get like a certain amount of wisdom that helps you navigate your way through complex situations. And so then that is what I'm spending like 100% of my time trying to do.
I love that. And so sort of, I think riffing off that, if you could have everyone listening to this start to ask themselves one question, what would that question be?
Okay, so then this is not what I was going to say. This is what I would say. So then, given a situation, the question is, what is the funniest way to respond to this? If you're asking yourself, like I've been hearing, like I've been watching comedians in cars with coffee and stuff like that, you know.
Okay.
And so what happens is comedians are just sitting there and they're asking, what's the funniest response to this? It turns out the funniest response is always going to be the least triggered and the most true response. So if you're trying to like hack truth, you may actually get closer to it from comedians than philosophers.
I love it.
And then it also has the side effect of keeping you like out of fight or flight, which is going to keep you in the super high performance state.
I love it. We're laughing and kicking ass at the same time.
I want that to be my new tagline.
It's perfect. All right. Well, Matt, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Just in closing, where can people reach out to you if they want to learn more about you or your practice or contribute to what you're up to in any way?
Yeah. So the podcast is at BioReset Podcast. And then our website's bioreset.com. And we're in Campbell, California, in Northern California, and would be delighted. You can call and talk to us and figure out what we're up to, and we'd love to connect with you.
Awesome. And we'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. But Matt, thank you so much for being here. An absolute pleasure.
Oh, you're the best.
You can find this BioReset podcast and others on iTunes, Spotify, and all other top podcast directories, as well as on bioresetpodcast.com. Make sure to subscribe, and thanks for listening.